Geography 10. The slides, I realized I didn't get them posted until just like an hour ago. The slides say lecture 15. I suppose maybe I should say lecture 16 because there were no slides last time. But anyway, I apologize for not getting these up here sooner. I also apologize because I realized finally I sorted it out. It had been kind of this question mark in my head the last week or so. I felt like I didn't quite have things lined up properly, and it's true, I didn't. I made a mistake. Today's lecture is supposed to be the beginning of the next section of the syllabus, and the topic for today is to include the end of colonialism, the independence of all of those colonies in Africa. So the readings for today should have included, we should have done Bernstein for last time instead of for today, the finishing up Bernstein. And the readings for today should have been the first two listed here, Rashid Khalidi's chapter from Resurrecting Empire and Ryszard Kapuscinski's chapter from the Soccer War. Those readings are both in your reader. And obviously I failed to tell you to get them read for today, so I'm not expecting you to have read them for today. As I said last time, next week I will be out of town, and we will watch 2 movies in lecture. So I figure that means that there's probably some time for you to do these readings between now and then. So what I'm asking now is that for next Thursday, you do those readings, even though I will not talk about them then, I will talk about them today. Your papers are due in lecture on Tuesday, as I'm sure you know. Then, once I'm back from Washington, D.C. in this conference, on Tuesday the 20th, I want you to read another chapter from a different book of Ryszard Kapuscinski's, this one called We're Closing Down the City, which is about the departure of the Portuguese from Angola at the end of that colonial setting. I also want you to pick up Mike Davis's book again, Planet of Slums, which we left off early in the semester, and read chapters 4 and 5 for Tuesday the 20th. By that point, we're very nearly at the end of the semester, as you know. For Thursday the 22nd, I'd like you to finish Planet of Slums. And for Thursday the 29th, I'd like you to read chapter 4 in Delaney. The missing date there, Tuesday the 27th, we will watch yet another movie. This one, an episode of Frontline about China and the Tiananmen Square protest and what's happened since then. One other note, that first week after I get back, so 2 weeks from now, there will be another map quiz. This one, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And I will get those maps posted before I take off next week. Are there any questions? So, a couple of things, just to start off. One of the things Bernstein notes in the chapter, when he draws towards the end, he talks about the ways in which native peoples in the colonies gained access to education, frequently through the auspices of missions and the church. And as they gained literacy, learned to read and write in English or French or the other languages of the colonial powers, they gained awareness of some of the philosophies and ideologies of Europe at the time. They learned about democracy. They learned about the idea of equality among all people. They learned the sort of doctrines of European Enlightenment liberalism. And as Bernstein notes, these were ideas that could be used to fight back against colonial rule because they blatantly contradicted the realities on the ground in the colonies. And in various ways, sometimes through the church, sometimes through other churches, sometimes through political organizing on other bases, perhaps in terms of labor, perhaps in terms of different kinds of ethnic nationalism, frequently some kind of mix among these various strands of ideas and organizations, they rose up against colonial rule. Here we want to talk about how colonialism came to an end. We want to talk about, I'm going to talk specifically again about the Congo and what came to be known as Zaire. I want to look at, in particular, the role of music in the end of colonial rule and the emergence of independent nation states in sub-Saharan Africa. Before we do that, though, we need to look briefly, at least, at another part of the world where colonialism did not take the same kind of form that it did in sub-Saharan Africa and much of the rest of the world, and that's the Middle East. As has been mentioned previously, the European powers were not able to move in and take over the Middle East in anything like the way that they were able to take over the New World, much of the rest of Africa, almost all of the rest of Africa, much of Asia. And that was because the Middle East, for hundreds of years, had been extremely well organized and powerful in the form of the Ottoman Empire. This is what made the Europeans sail around Africa to get to Asia rather than going overland through the Middle East or, until they built the Suez Canal, through here and the Red Sea. That entire end of the Mediterranean was sort of indomitable to those European powers at that time. So here we see a map of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks, beginning in 1300, just in that small area there, expanding in the 14th century to the Orange area, expanding by the middle of the 15th century to take up this whole area, including what's now Greece, expanding by the end of the 15th century still further around the Black Sea, further up into Europe, continuing to expand until by the end of the 17th century, they surrounded almost, well, roughly 2/3, say, of the Mediterranean, extending down around the Red Sea all the way to the Persian Gulf. They were a large and powerful empire. This then fell apart gradually over the course of the 19th century in ways that I'm not going to go into because I don't actually know the history very well. But as we've already noted, the Suez Canal, after it was built, provided the impetus and the pretext for the British and the French, and mainly the British, to take over Egypt. And by that point, the Ottoman Empire had shrunk considerably. And note the boundaries here at the end, Turkey in 1924, taking in this area here, and note this area over here, Armenia, which is striped, indicating that it was in fact in Turkey in 1924, but that is a struggle that we will talk about here briefly. Now, what's the next one? Oh, here's another map depicting the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire again from 1793 to 1923. And you can study this map in further detail on your own if you wish to get more of the details. The take-home point is that by the time of World War I, it was clear that the Ottoman Empire was in retreat, so to speak. It was shrinking. It was not nearly as powerful as it had been. The British were ascendant at this time. When World War I broke out, the Ottomans aligned themselves against the United States and Russia. And when Germany and the other powers aligned against the United States lost that war, the remaining territory or land of the Ottoman Empire fell under the general sort of, well, it was one of many territories that the winners of World War I proceeded to carve up and distribute among themselves. So the Germans also lost their colonies in Africa, that kind of thing. Now, this had actually been foreseen earlier. During World War I, the French and the British had met in secret and crafted a kind of agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 concerning how they would divide up control of the Middle East in the aftermath of the war. This map depicts that agreement. You'll see that the British wished to control directly this portion of what's now Iraq, including Baghdad and Basra. They intended to maintain influence over this larger area in a kind of buffer arrangement that it would extend all the way over to what became Israel and include Jordan. The French would have direct control of this area, extending up into what's now Turkey, and influence or control indirectly over this area, which includes what's now Syria. This was done in secret because at that point they weren't in a position to actually implement this, but this was motivated by the obvious consideration at that point in time, which was oil. When you read Khalidi, he will describe the events that raised oil to such significance at this time, and he zeroes in particular on a decision made by Winston Churchill, who was not yet Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was the Secretary of War. And they were deciding what to do with their naval investments, what kinds of investments to make in warships. And he made the decision that in order to stay ahead of the Germans and other potential rivals, they would need to convert their warships, or rather the next generation of warships that they built would be powered with oil rather than steam, rather than coal. This was a decision that had obvious military advantages. It allowed the ships to be faster, more powerful. It allowed them to carry more arms because they didn't have to devote so much weight to coal and water. And it committed the British to a whole new perspective on energy. Previously, they had been able to rely on the abundant supplies of coal found in their own country to power not only the Industrial Revolution and the factories, but also the ships, the naval ships and the trading ships that they used in international trade. Now they would have to rely on an energy source from overseas, and it was well known already at this point that the Middle East was where the largest such supplies were to be found. Hence the importance of securing some kind of control over this area. Now, here's a map depicting the ethnic makeup of this region. And you can see that there is obviously some pattern here, some concentration of Armenians here, Azerbaijanis here, that sort of thing. But for the most part, it is an extremely complex mix of lots and lots of different groups. We've seen a similar map to this earlier in the semester, if I remember correctly. And this posed and continues to pose serious challenges to the nation-state form. Right? The idea that you can demarcate territory on the ground that encloses both the political, legal, state sovereignty, and also somehow aligns with the idea of a nation, the idea of a group of people who share some kind of sense that they are a group, a collective, a community. Right? And in a lot of ways, this is exactly the same problem that the Europeans faced in Africa and in much of the world. The nation-state form, which had emerged in Europe and which had, so to speak, worked, although obviously with difficulties, in Europe, was very, very difficult to impose sort of unilaterally or by some kind of legal fiat in other parts of the world. And this, I want to talk briefly here about what happened in Turkey in the aftermath of World War I. I apologize if this gives us another rather depressing turn to match that of the Belgian Congo, but such is the history of these places and these phenomena. Khalidi writes on page 92, there had never been a state, empire, or nation of Iraq before British statesmen created it in the wake of World War I. That area that we now call Iraq, that Britain laid claim to through the Sykes-Picot Agreement and later dubbed Iraq, drew lines on the map and called Iraq, had never been unified in some kind of neatly territorial fashion. Even though it had been part of the Ottoman Empire, it had not been itself sort of organized as a nation. In fact, it had suffered a long history of sort of conquest, inclusion, various kinds. Lots and lots of peoples who lived within the Ottoman Empire were not themselves Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks did a lot of the same kinds of things, marginalizing other groups of people, exploiting them in various ways, not granting them equal rights. And in fact, the Armenians themselves, beginning in the latter half of the 19th century, began to press for better treatment, greater equality under the law, that sort of thing. A lot of European powers actually sympathized with some of these groups and urged the Ottomans to treat them more fairly. And various kinds of political bills were passed to try to grant them greater equality, although they remained very much persecuted. Other parts of the Middle East did have a greater prior sense of political organization or unity, one of them being Iran under the Persians, another one being Saudi Arabia. In any event, Khalidi tells this story. You'll see it. You'll read it when you get to it. And he describes these three different places, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And he tells the story of what kinds of machinations unfolded as the British and the French got involved in trying to sort of divvy this land up. And in some places, they struck political bargains with the existing powers, such as in Iran. In other places, they set up a whole new country, as in Iraq. In some places, they brokered deals along other terms. In any case, their interest was in the oil. And they found ways of securing concessions from these various constituted bodies to secure access to oil. These concessions were struck on very lopsided terms. Khalidi describes some of these. In other words, the British, through sort of quasi-private oil companies, secured access for very small amounts of money. And the amount that they were paying became a sort of political football on the ground in these places, with a lot of local people increasingly complaining that their oil was being taken from them and they weren't getting much of anything in return. They started to rise up. You remember at the very end of Brass, there's a slide in there, or a little moment at the end when they say that one of the British consular officials was killed in the streets of Tehran. These were the kinds of uprisings going on at just that time, still fighting over the conditions under which the British were extracting oil from the region. These uprisings and unrest were met with various degrees of repression. In some cases, some countries these uprisings succeeded and the oil resources of the countries were nationalized. In some cases, the uprisings took a kind of religious flavor, and you got a strong alliance between the nation-state form and particular religious organizations, or sects and churches, and Saudi Arabia being a strong example of this. In all cases, however, according to Khalidi, the actual wealth generated by oil continued to be concentrated in a very small number of hands, and tremendous wealth grew alongside continued poverty and backwardness, so to speak, among the mass of the population. And this has been dubbed the resource curse. Sorry. I won't go into that in great detail. There's a lot out there written about it, but it basically is the idea that in some cases having a lot of a valuable natural resource can prevent the kind of development and progress and economic prosperity that one might expect it could support, precisely because it can be monopolized or controlled by a very small number of people, and if those people assume the reins of power of the nation-state as well, they then have both political and economic power, and they tend to, or can get away with, using it in what we might simply call selfish ways, enriching themselves and letting the rest of the country continue to be poor. Now, just a little sidelight here on oil resources. Continues to be the case that the Middle East is the location of the vast majority of the world's oil resources. You can see here it's not quite 2/3 of the world's oil reserves. North America, by contrast, has very small. Europe as well, Latin America. Here it is broken out by countries. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iran, all of them have vastly more. I mean, note this bar here. This is actually a break, because otherwise this bar would have to go to about here. So that's Saudi Arabia's share of the world's oil resources. These are to depict oil fields that are already in operation in the dark purple and known oil deposits in the lighter purple. So this concentration continues to be lopsided and extremely important in the world's economy. Here is nations of the world depicted according to their size here, reflective of the amount of oil that they control. So Saudi Arabia would be the largest country in the world if it could somehow turn its oil into territory. Iran also would be roughly the size of Russia, a little bigger. The United States would be quite small. Venezuela looks significantly larger than the rest of South America, that kind of thing. So Khalidi's chapter is an attempt to give you a history of the sort of alternative path that unfolded in the Middle East due to the combination of the prior political power of the Ottomans, preventing direct European colonial conquest, but followed by these oil-inflected machinations and re-territorializations of the Middle East following World War I, many of which continue to this day. The legacies of that period are extremely important to understanding what is happening right now in the Middle East. And when we get to the last chapter of Delaney, we'll talk a little bit about Israel and Palestine and that history. To get back to the Armenians and the Turks, briefly. There were Armenians scattered throughout much of what's now Turkey at the beginning of World War I, and they had long been persecuted as an ethnic minority within the Ottoman Empire. And the Turks, in the context of World War I, decided that it was time to get rid of these Armenians, probably in anticipation of precisely the kinds of events that were going to unfold following the Sykes-Picot Agreement, trying to secure a greater amount of territory, or perhaps more clearly, trying to ensure that the Armenians did not claim all of the territory where they were in the majority. And the Turks began to drive the Armenians out of most of Turkey and expel them in what's come to be known, without too much controversy anymore, as the Armenian Genocide. This is a point of contention in international relations to this day. Something like 20 countries have formally recognized this as a genocide. According to some scholars, this was the first genocide in the full modern sense of the term. The Turkish government objects to the notion that this was a genocide and has many, many times prevented the United States from acknowledging that this was a genocide and used its leverage as a key U.S. ally in the Middle East to prevent that kind of recognition. The fact that this happened a long time ago and it's a matter of history does not prevent it from continuing to be extremely important in Turkey. I believe it's still the case that under Turkish law, you're not allowed to say that it was a genocide, and people who do so are sometimes prosecuted and thrown in jail. In any event, here's a map depicting the movements and roughly the number of people. It's believed that something like 1 million to 1.5 million people died. These were forced marches accompanied by a great deal of violence. They were not given any food or water. The expectation was really that they would die en route if they were not killed directly. Here's a passage from a diplomatic report from the U.S. consul in Aleppo from 1915. It is extremely rare to find a family intact, about all the men having been separated from the families and suffered fates that had best be left unmentioned, many being done away with in atrocious manners before the eyes of their relatives and friends. There seems to have been about 1 million persons lost up to this date. Here you see a map, and you'll notice that Turkish Armenia, this area in the northeastern portion of what's now Turkey, was assigned to Armenia at the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. So this is after World War I. And this was precisely the kind of thing that the Turkish government was not interested in. They did not want to see happen. And this was the kind of, by driving the Armenians out of this area, they helped strengthen their claim to control this land. Under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, they would not have, they would have been part of Turkey, but I'm not quite sure the details here. But you notice that Armenia itself is much smaller.